Hello, welcome back to Bioclass Bites. In this video, we are going to talk about the discovery of evolution. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like and share this video. We are still under the subunit, the evidence for evolution, and here we will talk about the discovery of evolution. These are the lessons under this topic. So we will try to trace the development of the theory of evolution from fixed species to transmutation to the discovery of fossils to Charles Darwin's voyage and his discovery of the theory of the natural selection to Huxley versus Wilberforce debate to genetics up to the modern synthesis of the evolution theory and the opposition in studying and teaching evolution. So, beginning in classical times and which persisted long after the Renaissance period, scientists thought that species and organisms and all the living things around us were fixed or unchangeable, or to use the language of that era, immutable. It means that they no longer change. They are created as they are and they are placed here on earth as they are. This reasoning ran something like this. So this is what scientists and other philosophers thought during that time. So if God's creation was perfect from the start, so why would he bother to change them or tinker with it at a later date? So that was the idea during those times that species were fixed, that organisms are fixed, they were created as they are, they do not have to change, they were created by a divine being, therefore the creations are perfect as well. So that's that, okay? And we can see here a fresco by Michelangelo, The Creation of Adam, very well known piece of art. So that also encapsulates this reasoning that I was talking a while ago. Around 1800s, scientists began to wonder whether species are really fixed or they could change or transmute over time. They started to doubt if the fixed species or immutability of organisms are actually true and enough to explain the, the nature around them. One of the first scientists to challenge fixed species was John Baptist Lamarck. He thought that if an animal acquired or gained a characteristic during its lifetime, it could pass it on to its offspring. So that was his first idea. He tried to explain that giraffes possibly got their long necks through generations of straining to reach high branches. So this is an illustration of John Baptist Lamarck. So his idea, okay, his theory, his initial idea of acquiring a characteristic throughout its lifetime and passing on to its offspring is known as the Lamarckian inheritance or the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So to visualize, so this is what Lamarck was trying to say. So the proposed ancestor of giraffes could actually look like the modern day okapi. Okay, they have shorter necks and all that. However, due to their effort to reach higher leaves up the branches of trees, they start to stretch and stretch their necks. Okay, so every time they manage to stretch their necks and they have offspring, then their offspring are born. Their offspring will be born having longer neck than the ancestors. So as time goes by, that stretching and stretching of their necks eventually becomes a new trait or a new characteristic of its descendants. So that was his theory. So acquired variation is passed on to the descendants. So this is one of the first thoughts or one of the first theories to challenge fixed species. Okay. However, another scientist challenged the Lamarckian theory of inheritance. So, August Friedrich Leopold Weismann suggested that in a multicellular organism, inheritance can only take place by means of germ cells, or gametes such as egg cells and sperm cells. This was eventually known as the germplasm theory. So he said that germ cells, so those are your egg and sperm, can produce somatic cells, and are not affected by anything the somatic cells learn throughout its lifetime, or any ability an individual acquires throughout its life. So if you still remember our lesson about sexual reproduction, haploid egg cells and haploid sperm cells unite during fertilization to produce a diploid zygote. Okay, now that zygote will produce somatic cells or body cells, which will grow and develop into a new organism. Now anything that the body cells, okay, acquired or learned throughout its lifetime cannot be passed on to its egg cells and or sperm cells because of what was referred to the Weismann barrier. So if the changes only happen in body cells, then it will remain in body cells. So only those changes or mutation that happened at the germplasm level or at the germ cell level, such as egg and sperm, only changes in those type of cells can be inherited by the offspring. So in order to support his claim, Weismann conducted an experiment, okay? So this was a summary of his mouse tail experiment, which spanned 19 generations and produced 901 young. So the results of this concluded that mutilations or modifications of the soma of the body cells are not heritable. So this is what he tried to do. So this is the um, mother organism, mother mouse, and then father organism, and then he amputated the tail of those parents. Okay, so he amputated the tail for several generations. However, they keep on producing offspring with long tails. So if you still remember, according to Lamarck, any changes that happen in the parent's body will be inherited by the offspring. But this experiment by Weismann concluded that Lamarck's inheritance or soft inheritance is not correct. That changes in the parent's bodies cannot be passed on to its offspring. Only changes in their germ cells, egg and sperm, can be inherited by their offspring. Okay, so these are further illustrations to help you. So the germ cells are your sperm and egg. So during fertilization, they unite to form an organism. So that organism is made up of somatic cells. So all the cells that make up its body are called somatic cells. Then eventually, this organism, if it is male, will produce its own future sperm cells, or if it is a female, it will produce its own egg cells. So those are that organism's germ cells. Now, somatic mutations, okay, or changes within the body. Okay, so for example, egg and sperm, then this is the organism, then a mutation happened within its, for example, its body. So for example, a mutation happened here, okay, patch of affected area on its shoulders. It will not be, transferred, or it will not cross the Weismann barrier. It will not be inherited by its offspring, okay, because none of its gametes, none of its sperm cells or egg cells will inherit the mutation. Only changes in the germ line or germ cells can be inherited. So for example, the sperm cell here had a mutation, a germline mutation. Then we have here a normal egg. So the mutation can be passed on to the offspring. Okay? And then that offspring will grow and develop. Then the entire organism now carries the mutation, including its own gametes. So if it's a male, including its own sperm cells. So this is the Weismann barrier. So this is the Weismann barrier. So any mutation that occurs within the body, okay, cannot be passed on to its offspring. Now, any mutation from the sperm cells, from the germ line, from the egg and sperm can be passed on and can be inherited by the offspring and its future offspring. So around the same time that Weismann was disproving the Lamarckian inheritance, um, Geologists such as William Smith were beginning to map the rocks and fossils of Britain, and they were able to discover that rocks were laid down based on their excavations and their explorations, that rocks were laid down in a certain order, and that different fossils and different layers lived at different intervals of geological time. So if you still remember our lesson about the rock cycle, on how sediments are laid one on top of the other as they are cemented over due to pressure and other geologic forces. And they also found out that there are fossils of different organisms that are exclusively found in specific layers of the layers of the earth. So here is a clear evidence that different species have existed in the past compared to what we have today. So from 1831 to 1836, Charles Robert Darwin toured the world aboard HMS Beagle. Okay, the mission of this ship was to survey the coast of South America, and Charles Darwin was on board among other scientists and naturalists. And of course, he was dazzled by the diversity of life he saw there, and started to wonder how those variety might have originated. So throughout his voyage, he collected a lot of specimens and consulted a lot of fellow scientists and naturalists. And in 1859, in his work on the origin of species, so this is the shortened title, but this is the complete title of his work, on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. He proposed how one species might have given rise to another species. So this was the essence of his work, okay, the essence of natural selection. Where food was limited, competition meant that only the fittest would survive. Okay? Not the strongest, not the biggest, but only the fittest would survive in that environment. This will lead to the natural selection of the best adapted individuals. So naturally selected are those who can adapt to that competition, and only those who can adapt can reproduce and pass on their traits, which will eventually cause the evolution of a new species. So if you still remember our lesson about ecosystem, we know that this is true, that there's no such thing as unlimited resources, that eventually the population will reach the carrying capacity of the ecosystem, and eventually they will feel the effects of environmental resistance, and some of them would die off, or some of them will not survive and have their own offspring. So only those who are fit with the new environment, or who can survive the competition, will be able to adapt to their situation. So let's look at this diagram to further understand what natural selection was. So these are the two conditions first. According to Darwin, there will always be overproduction of offspring. Populations produce too many young. Okay, there's more offspring than the ecosystem can sustain. Because of that, many must die eventually. And if you still remember our lesson on survivorship curve, some could have early loss, some could have late loss, some could have constant loss throughout their lifetime. Okay? Aside from that, there's variation within a population. So if this is a group of snails, okay, there are variations or differences between them. It could be the color or the pigment of their shells, or the length of their body, or how long their structures are. So individuals show variation. The same way with humans. We are not clones of each other. We are products of sexual reproduction and genetic recombination. Some of us are taller, some are shorter, some have bigger eyes, some have smaller eyes, some have better eye vision, some do not. So some variations of those organisms can be favorable than other organisms' variation. Now, if you put these two together, overproduction and variation, there will be, okay, a competition among the offspring of who will survive. So that's where natural selection comes in. Natural selection favors the best suited at the time. So, for example, if they are living in muddy waters, so it would be expected that those darkly pigmented snails will be the one to survive because they could camouflage better, and the light-colored snails will be easily seen by the predator and will be easily eaten, so they will not be able to reproduce. So overproduction and then variation within the population, then natural selection favors the best suited at the time. Now, since the light-colored snails are not selected and they did not survive and they did not pass on their traits, so only the dark-colored snails will be the one to grow, to reproduce, and pass on their traits. Okay, so variations are inherited, and the suited variants were able to have more offspring. Now, where does speciation or the separation of species happen here? How does this create different species? If this will happen over and over, eventually the gene for the white colored or light colored snail will eventually be disappear from the population. Okay, if there's no one reproducing of the same trait or passing on of that light colored trait, then it will eventually disappear from the population. Now, how do we know that speciation or evolution has occurred? If we introduce this new group of darkly colored snail with their previous population, okay, or with their previous group of light colored snails, and then they do not mate anymore. If the changes were so huge that they no longer interbreed, or even if they interbreed, they no longer produce fertile offspring, then we can conclude that these dark-colored snails have evolved already and is now a new species. Okay? Are you following? So again, let's use another example. So for example, here in for humans, there are too many humans on this planet. Okay, more than what the planet can sustain. And among humans, there are variations within us. Some are tall, short, fair skinned, dark skinned, and all that. Then natural selection will occur. For example, only those dark-colored humans will be the ones to survive. For example, if a catastrophe happen, okay, they are the ones who keep on surviving. Then they're the ones who can pass on their trait. Okay. If there come a time, and then eventually they will create a whole new group of darkly colored humans. Okay. If there comes a time, for example, that this new group met with the original population of humans and they can no longer interbreed, even if they can interbreed, they can no longer produce fertile humans, fertile offspring, then we can say that this new group of humans have already evolved, have already is now considered a new species. So evolution has occurred, and we now have two groups of humans. Okay, or for example, if we sent this group to Mars, okay? So humans, we now have humans on Mars, and then they stayed there, for example, for 200 years, and they started to, they had their own adaptations to survive with their environment. They changed some of their characteristics, and then if they return to Earth and they are introduced to the humans on Earth and they no longer interbreed or produce fertile offspring, then we can say that those humans from Mars are already considered a new species. So this is how natural selection tries to explain how new species are produced over time through natural selection and through inheritance of those variations. So again, so this is how Darwinian evolution works in a nutshell. Random mutations can cause variation, okay, in a population. These different organisms compete and survive to reproduce, okay. Those with the best able to survive and reproduce tend to leave the most offspring. So that's natural selection there. And over time, if some organisms survive and reproduce more than others, a species will evolve. Okay? You can actually visit this website, ideacenter.org, for more information about evolutionary theory in a nutshell. Now, this is what evolution claims, okay, according to Darwin. Because of that, we can actually create a tree that shows us that all organisms are related because we all share a common ancestor. We can actually go back and trace back in time how organisms diverge from each other and what was their common ancestor. Another thing, all organisms arose through random process of mutation. So due to mutation that creates the variation, that's another force of evolution. All organisms arose and persist because of unguided natural selection, which can only select for actual beneficial mutations. Okay, so whatever mutations that those organisms have that allow them to survive in their environment, ayun, that's those are mostly called beneficial mutations. Now, this is so if we extrapolate and study it deeper, this is what evolution was trying to say, that we can actually that humans were actually related to other mammals such as other primates, okay, other monkeys, other primates, and then mammals are related to reptiles and fish and amphibians, and we can actually trace back in time where life started. And those, according to, of course, we've studied this in history of the origin of life, we can all trace our origin from those bacteria or the first protocells that might have started in the primitive Earth, back to DNA or protein world or RNA world, back to prebiotic synthesis, if you still remember the primordial soup, if you still remember abiogenesis, okay, the Miller-Urey experiment, then back into the origin of the Earth, back into the origin of the universe. So evolution tried to remove the magical essence of humans that was that was quite common during those times, that we were created special, but we are, in reality, we are just one of the many creatures that evolved over time. Now, Charles Darwin was not the only one who thought of natural selection. Another British naturalist named Alfred Wallace actually co-developed the theory of natural selection with Charles Darwin. However, since Charles Darwin was the one who published his work first, he was the one who was credited with the idea. But Wallace and Darwin were actually in correspondence with each other as they developed their own theories. So Wallace traveled through Brazil and various islands of Malay archipelago that make up the modern-day Indonesia and Philippines, where he collected thousands of specimens of insects, birds, and other animals. He also arrived at the same conclusion as Charles Darwin. So he knew that Darwin was working on a similar research. In 1859, he sent Darwin a letter outlining his ideas, and they collaborated on a scientific paper. So in 1858, a year after, Darwin published his book on the theory of natural selection. So though Wallace's contribution to the study of evolution, sadly, they were often forgotten. So we should not forget about Alfred Wallace, the same way we should not forget about Rosalind Franklin and her contribution to the DNA model. Okay, so this one, the Darwin Wallace Medal, was issued by the Linnean Society. Okay, on the reading of Darwin and Wallace's paper on natural selection. So we should always remember that Charles Darwin was not the only one who thought of natural selection. We have another scientist in the name of Alfred Wallace, so who went to a different part of the globe, but still arrived at the same conclusion as Charles Darwin. So if you want, I recommend that you watch this video, Darwin and Natural Selection. This is from Crash Course. I will provide the link in the description below. Now, as you may know, when Charles Darwin proposed the theory of natural selection, a lot of people became uncomfortable because it was actually, they saw it as a direct attack against religion. Because again, at this point, what was being taught at churches was that humans are created by God, therefore we are stewards of all his creations, and there's something special and magical about us. But according to Darwin, we are just products of natural selection, just like the rest of the animal kingdom and the rest of the organisms. So Darwin's idea of evolution was met with huge controversy, and one of the most famous debates was took place in 1860 between Bishop Charles Samuel Wilberforce of the Church of England against Darwin's defender Thomas Henry Huxley. So these are caricatures of those men. Okay, so this one is actually a scene from a movie about the Huxley Wilberforce debate. So I recommend that you watch this video so that you will see why it was such a heated debate during their time, why it was such a controversial debate on that time. So I do not want to spoil the details, but there's a lot of juicy replies coming from the side of Huxley. So I recommend that you watch this video. I'll provide the link in the description below. So these are just examples of some caricature of newspapers and magazines making fun of Darwin. So here they drew Charles Darwin with the body of an ape and then with his head. Okay, so another here. Okay, so that man wants to claim my pedigree and all that. So it says that we are descendants of apes and what else? So these are more caricatures making fun of evolution, okay, and all that. So this is another one, a Parisian caricature of Darwin, okay, wherein he was made fun, okay, just for proposing natural selection. So now this one is from the website International Darwin Day. I recommend that you visit this. It talks about the Huxley-Wilberforce debate, the backstory, and eventually what happened. So I'll provide the link in the description below. This one is from the Museum of Natural History. So this was still referring to the great debate of Huxley versus Wilberforce in 1860. So again, visit this for more information. I'll provide the link in the description below. Now, around that time, 1856, a monk called Gregor Mendel cultivated 29,000 pea plants to investigate how evolution worked. Okay, but really what he was focusing on was his interest was how characteristics were passed down from generations. And through his experiments, through his work, he was able to figure out the basic principles of genetics, though it was not yet called genetics during his time. So in his work, he was able to show that offspring received characteristics from both parents, but only the dominant characteristic traits was expressed. Um, However, much of his work was not entertained or was not well accepted by the scientific community. Even Gregor Mendel himself does not know the application of his findings. So nobody really talked much about his work. It was only around 1900s when long after his death, that was the time wherein people started to look into his work. So I hope you still remember when you took this lesson in grade 8 no, about genetics. But to remind you, I recommend that you watch this video from TED Ed entitled How Mendel's Pea Plants Helped Us Understand Genetics. I'll provide the link in the description below. So this was his experimental design, if you still remember. So he tried to create pure hybrids of each type of pea plant, okay? So through self-fertilization, so he was able to create hybrids for that. And then through cross-pollination, he created or he facilitated the creation of its offspring. So as you can see here, even if one of the parents have white flowers, all of the offspring have purple flowers. So what does it mean? Okay. So he tried now from this generation, for the F1 generation, he tried to have interbreeding. Okay, he tried to cross fertilize this generation, and then eventually that trait for the white flower popped up. It means that, or appeared. It means that they are still carrying the trait or the factor or the gene for the white flower. They are not just showing it, but on their next generation, that gene could eventually manifest itself. So he tried that for the different traits of the peas: seed, seed color, flower position, flower color, plant height, pod shape, and pod color. And this was his consistent findings, that there's almost a 3:1 ratio for every 4 offspring, that mostly the dominant traits, such as round, yellow, purple, will appear most often, while the recessive traits, wrinkled, white, terminal, short, constricted, will appear less often. So this led him to conclude that traits can be passed on from parents to offspring, and that only the dominant traits are the ones expressed by the offspring. Now, if you want to refresh your memory, I recommend that you visit this lecture from grade 8 about Mendelian genetics. I'll provide the link in the description below. Now, what made Mendel's work important in the study of evolution? Now, natural selection was the theory proposed by Darwin. So we've talked about this, everything about this we know already. However, in his work, Darwin cannot explain two things. He cannot explain how variation occurs within a population. He cannot explain why. He knows that there are variation. He proposed that there are variation, but he cannot explain why we have differences within the population. Why some are short, some are tall, some have this, some are like this. He cannot explain why, and he also cannot explain how traits are inherited. Now that's where Mendel's work come in. He was able to explain why there are variations within a population. He was able to explain how traits were inherited. So during the time of Mendel, he does not know yet, 1856, 1863, he does not know yet the application of his work. Only through time, through the work of future scientists and thinkers, were they able to combine the ideas of Darwin and Mendel to come up with a more holistic explanation about evolution. So that's what we call the modern synthesis of evolution. So in the early 20th century, scientists started to make sense on how evolution works. So building on Mendel's work on how explaining how variation occurs and how traits are inherited, um, studies showed that studies showed how characters in a population could be selected by environmental pressures. So this led them to create the modern synthesis of theory of evolution, as Julian Huxley, called a descendant of Thomas Huxley. And he was able to brought back to the center of evolutionary theory, Darwin's theory of natural selection. So the modern synthesis, or the neo-Darwinism, has the following supporting evidence, okay, or supporting theories. So they, again, the same thing, but with better understanding of how things work. So it combines Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. It combined Mendel's laws of heredity, or laws of inheritance. It combined what we know about cytogenetics, or the genetics of cells, population genetics, okay, molecular genetics, okay, and other stuff such as cultural evolution and others. So combination of all these works, all the scientific findings, led to the following: the modern synthesis theory of evolution. So this describes the fusion or merger of Mendelian genetics with Darwinian evolution. So this is now the unified theory of evolution that scientists have right now. So whenever we talk about evolution, this is what we refer to. Whenever scientists talk about evolution, or biology teachers or biologists talk about evolution, these are the facts that we are thinking about, not just from the common, from apes to man and all that. Okay, those are caricatures of those people who are not familiar with evolution. So whenever the theory of evolution is mentioned, this is what should be clear. The modern synthesis recognizes that genes, okay, those are the segments of DNA that codes for a protein, are responsible for the inheritance of characteristics. So this is from Mendel. So genes are the ones that are responsible for the inheritance of characteristics. Number two, modern synthesis recognizes that populations, or groups of organisms, not individual organisms, evolve due to mechanisms: natural selection and genetic drift. Not just natural selection, but also genetic drift. So again, it's the population, it's the group, okay? Population, group of organisms that are interbreeding. They are the ones who evolve, not individuals. And lastly, it recognizes that speciation, or the creation of new species, just like what we've talked about here, the creation of new species, so one, two species, is due to gradual accumulation of small genetic changes. So this is gradual. The creation of new species happen gradually, not instantly, over hundreds and thousands and millions of years, due to the accumulation of small genetic changes. So this is now the theory of evolution. So this is what I'm referring to whenever I say the word evolution. Okay? Genes, populations, and speciation. So I hope that clarifies the theory, okay? Now, sadly, despite the achievement of the scientific community about evolution and all scientists agreeing with each other, some Christian groups are still, opposed to the idea of or the concept of evolution. So in 1925, one of the most well-known trials that tried to outlaw the teaching of evolution was the Scopes monkey trial. Okay, so this was in 1925. So this is a video about this, a history brief, the Scopes trial. I recommend that you watch this video so that you'll be familiar of this event. I'll provide the link in the description below. This one is from history, okay, the monkey trial, the Scopes monkey trial. So I recommend that you read this website, the article from this website. I'll provide the link in the description below. So in a nutshell, so what happened here was that John Thomas Scopes, a young high school science teacher, was accused of teaching evolution. And that is actually a violation of a Tennessee state law. So they had a trial all about it. They call it the monkey trial, referring to evolution as, descendants of monkeys and all that. So I recommend that you look into it. Okay, quite an interesting trial. It was, a turning point for the teaching of evolution during that time. So at this point, let me share this question to you. So usually in my regular classes, I would ask this question to my students, and then they would share their thoughts. However, we cannot do that because of our unique situation. So let me just read this to you. So a thought to ponder. Religious opposition to evolution continues to the present day. Yes, I can vouch for that. However, today's opposition to evolution is often more subtle. For example, several US states have recently argued that evolution and creationism should be given equal time in the science classroom, not religious studies, not Christian living, in science classroom. Creationism maintains that a literal reading of the book of Genesis in the Bible is the only adequate explanation for how life came into being, and that the concept of evolution is incorrect. Now, my question to you is, should creationism and evolution be given equal time in the science classroom? So what do you think? So that ends our video. I hope you learned something new today. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like and share this video. Till next time, goodbye.